The 6th to 5th floor of the Vance Tower did not merely overlook Manhattan, it seemed to judge it. Constructed entirely of reinforced structural glass, polished titanium, and dark, bleeding heart mahogany, the executive suite of Sterling Vance was an architectural manifestation of absolute leverage. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the winter sky over New York was the color of a wet slate, spitting a bitter mix of sleet and snow that blurred the edges of the Chrysler Building. Inside, the temperature was a mathematically perfect 71 degrees, smelling faintly of expensive beeswax, aged peat, and the distinct, high-voltage ozone of unchecked corporate power. Sterling Vance stood by the glass, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a bespoke charcoal suit that bore the unmistakable, razor-sharp drape of Savile Row. He was 46, possessed a jawline that looked as though it had been carved from a block of granite by an artist who specialized in cruelty, and maintained a net worth that fluctuated by more in an hour than the average American household earned in a lifetime. To Sterling, the world was not divided into good and bad, or rich and poor. It was divided into those who dictated terms and those who accepted them. Behind him, standing on a Persian rug that had taken 3 weavers 4 years to knot by hand, was Thomas Miller. Thomas did not look like he belonged on a 4-year knot rug. He was 34, though the faint, silvery tracks of stress around his eyes made him look 40. His suit was off the rack, charcoal adjacent, and slightly shiny at the elbows from hundreds of hours spent leaning over spreadsheets. His tie was straight, but the knot was slightly frayed at the edges, and on his left wrist sat a stark, ridiculous contrast to the luxury of the room, a bright red, scratch-faced plastic Spider-Man digital watch. Between them lay a heavy, 3-inch thick manila folder containing the finalized data architecture for the upcoming Vanguard merger, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition that would consolidate Sterling's dominance over the global logistics sector. Thomas had spent the last 72 straight hours pulling the numbers together. His eyes were bloodshot, tracking like broken compasses. "Look at the weather out there, Thomas," Sterling said, his voice a rich, low baritone that had commanded boardrooms from Zurich to Tokyo. He didn't turn around. Chaos. Delays. People freezing on the subway platforms, praying the trains run so they don't lose their hourly wages. Do you know why they endure it? Thomas didn't answer right away. He kept his posture straight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I imagine they have families to feed, Mr. Vance." Sterling chuckled, a dry, rhythmic sound that carried no warmth. He turned around, stepping away from the glass. He approached his massive desk, which was entirely clear save for a crystal tumbler and a bottle of single malt scotch that was older than Thomas. "They endure it because they have no choice," Sterling corrected, pouring himself 2 fingers of the amber liquid. He didn't offer any to Thomas. Choice is a luxury reserved for those who can afford the fallout. Which brings us to this utterly absurd request sitting on my desk. Sterling picked up a single sheet of paper that sat atop the Vanguard folder. It was a formal request for a 2-week unpaid leave of absence, signed in neat, precise block lettering by Thomas. 2 weeks, Sterling murmured, shaking his head as if looking at a poorly written punchline. During the absolute zenith of the Vanguard integration. The data migration begins on Monday night. You are the architect of the entire structural pipeline. If the data pipelines twist even a fraction of a percent, the entire valuation algorithm drops by $300 million. And you want to go? Where, exactly? "My daughter, Lily," Thomas said. His voice was remarkably level, devoid of the frantic pleading Sterling was accustomed to hearing from subordinates. "She has her final corrective surgery on Tuesday morning at New York Presbyterian. It's a transposition of the great arteries. It's open heart, Mr. Vance. It will take 9 hours." Sterling took a slow sip of his scotch, letting the heat of it settle before speaking. "I am aware of the medical situation, Thomas. I am also aware that the hospital employs the finest pediatric cardiologists in the Western Hemisphere. Are you a surgeon?" "No, sir." "Are you a nurse?" "No." "Then let me ask you a logical question. What value do you add to that operating room by sitting in a vinyl chair in a waiting room, drinking terrible machine coffee, while your team here collapses under the weight of a broken data stream?" Sterling leaned forward, placing both palms flat on the mahogany. "You are an analyst. Quantify the utility of your presence there versus your presence here." Thomas's jaw tightened. The plastic Spider-Man watch beeped once, a tiny, tinny chirp indicating the top of the hour. It sounded incredibly loud in the cavernous room. "When she wakes up in the ICU," Thomas said softly, "she will have a chest tube, an arterial line, and a ventilator in her throat. She will be terrified. She won't know where she is. The doctors told me that the first voice she hears needs to be someone she trusts, or her heart rate could spike to dangerous levels. She has no one else, Mr. Vance. Her mother died when she was 2. I am the utility. Sterling sighed, a theatrical display of patience being pushed to its absolute limit. He walked around the desk, stopping just 2 feet from Thomas. Sterling was taller, broader, his physical presence amplified by the invisible weight of his billions. We all have tragedies, Thomas. We all have personal lives, Sterling said, his tone shifting from analytical to sharply condescending. But the corporate world does not pause for parental anxiety. Do you know how many analysts are currently in line for your office on the 62nd floor? Young, hungry Ivy League grads who don't have children, don't have wives, don't have hobbies, and would happily sleep under their desks for the next 6 months just to catch a glimpse of the bonuses I hand out. I'm sure there are many, Thomas said. Then let's speak plainly, Sterling said, his eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. He had run the numbers on Thomas Miller months ago. He knew Thomas's base salary. He knew the cost of the specialized out-of-network pediatric care Lily required. He knew the exact balance of Thomas's bank account within a 10% margin of error. Thomas was drowning in debt, sustained only by the platinum-tier corporate health insurance policy provided exclusively to senior analysts at Vance Global. Sterling knew he held every single card in the deck. He had the house, the table, and the dealer. You aren't taking the leave, Sterling said flatly. Mr. Vance, I've given this company 3 years of 80-hour weeks, Thomas said, a sudden spark of heat entering his voice. I've built the algorithms that saved you $40 million on the European shipping corridors alone. I have earned these 2 weeks. You have earned what I choose to pay you, Sterling snapped back, his voice cutting like a scalpel. And right now, I am paying you to be here on Monday night. If you walk out of this building for 2 weeks, you don't come back. Your badge will be deactivated before you hit the lobby. Your corporate insurance will terminate at midnight on the last day of the month. Do you understand the implications of that for your daughter's ongoing post-operative care? The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It was a brutal piece of leverage, the kind Sterling used to break rival CEOs and hostile boards. Thomas looked at the billionaire. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't blink. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, muffled rattle of the sleet against the heavy glass windows. Sterling smiled, a small, triumphant smirk. He could see the calculation happening behind Thomas's eyes. He could see the fear. He knew the man was going to fold. They always folded. Let's put an end to this posturing, Thomas, Sterling said, turning his back to walk back to his leather chair. I'll tell you what. If you truly believe that sitting in a hospital waiting room is more important than the career you've spent a decade building, then prove it. Why don't you just quit? Go on. Walk out that door, go down to your cubicle, and pack your things. I dare you. Let's see how far your paternal utility gets you when the billing department at New York Presbyterian calls for your new insurance card. Sterling sat down, picking up his fountain pen, entirely dismissed the man from his mind. The dare wasn't a real dare. It was an execution. It was the ultimate demonstration of absolute ownership over another human being's time and life. I'm waiting, Sterling added, not looking up from his papers. Either tell me you'll be here Monday, or go pack your desk. Thomas stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then, his shoulders, which had been hunched under the weight of the last 3 years, slowly dropped. A strange, sudden calmness washed over his face, erasing the exhaustion, leaving behind something clean and terrifyingly sharp. All right, Thomas said. Sterling didn't look up. All right, you'll be here Monday? Wise choice. No, Thomas said, his voice entirely devoid of anger, possessing a quiet, ringing clarity that made Sterling's pen stop mid-stroke. All right, I accept the dare. Sterling's brow furrowed. He lifted his head. What did you say? Thomas stepped forward. He reached out and neatly closed the 3-inch thick Vanguard folder. Then, with his left hand, he reached up to his lapel, unpinned his heavy, silver-plated executive security badge, the one that granted him access to the high-security server rooms and the executive elevators, and placed it squarely on top of the manila folder. I quit, Mr. Vance, Thomas said. Sterling stared at the badge. The silver plating reflected the harsh overhead LED lights. Thomas, don't be a fool. You're having a stress response. Take a breath and think about what you're doing. "I am thinking," Thomas said, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked Sterling directly in the eyes without a shred of deference. "For 3 years, I thought you were a genius who understood the value of systems. But you don't. You're just a man with a massive hammer who thinks everything looks like a nail. You think my daughter's life is a variable you can leverage in a negotiation." "It is a variable," Sterling said, his voice hardening as his anger flared. "It's the variable that keeps you compliant. You leave this room, and you are financially ruined within 90 days. You won't make it past the elevators." "Watch me," Thomas said. He turned on his heel and walked toward the massive, double-hung mahogany doors of the executive suite. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the heavy brass handle, stepped out into the wide, carpeted hallway of the executive floor, and let the doors click shut behind him. Sterling sat in his leather chair, his fountain pen still hovering over the paper. His heart gave a strange, unfamiliar thud against his ribs. A bluff, his mind insisted immediately. It's an theatrical outburst. He's an analyst. He knows the data. He's going to walk down to the 62nd floor, sit at his desk, realize he has $42 in his checking account after the last medical copay, and is going to come back up here with his tail between his legs. Sterling looked at the silver badge sitting on the folder. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The silence in the executive suite became oppressive. The absolute certainty that had guided Sterling's life for 2 decades suddenly felt like a thin sheet of ice over a very deep, very cold lake. With a low curse, Sterling slammed his pen down onto the desk. He stood up, throwing his jacket open, and strode out of his office. He didn't take the executive elevator. He used the private internal staircase that connected the top 3 floors of the building, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the steel and marble steps. When he reached the 62nd floor, the analytics bullpen, he slammed the heavy fire door open, fully expecting to find Thomas Miller sitting at his desk, staring at a blank monitor, perhaps with his head in his hands, weeping over his own stupidity. Instead, Sterling walked into a wall of absolute, deadening silence. The 62nd floor was normally a chaotic hive of noise, the rhythmic clacking of mechanical keyboards, the low buzz of analysts arguing over predictive models, the constant chime of incoming Slack messages, and the hum of printers churning out financial data. Right now, nobody was typing. Nobody was talking. Nearly 60 analysts, junior developers, and project managers were standing up in their glass-walled cubicles, their heads turned toward the far corner of the room. Sterling followed their gaze. Thomas Miller was at his desk. But he wasn't crying. He wasn't staring at his screen. He had pulled a large, collapsible black fabric crate from beneath his desk, the kind of crate people kept in their trunks for groceries. It was already half full. Thwack. Thomas dropped a heavy, leather-bound volume of advanced statistical mathematics into the bottom of the box. Clack. A small, hand-painted ceramic pencil holder followed. It was painted in bright, messy strokes of pink and yellow, with the words Daddy's pens written in the erratic handwriting of a 5-year-old child. Sterling felt a sudden, visceral jolt of panic in his chest. It was the exact same feeling he had felt 15 years ago when a hostile European conglomerate had secretly bought up 40% of his supply chain before he even realized they were on the board. It was the feeling of a system losing control. "Thomas," Sterling said, his voice ringing out across the quiet floor like a gunshot. Several junior analysts jumped, immediately looking down at their desks, terrified of catching the billionaire's eye. But Thomas didn't jump. He didn't even stop what he was doing. He reached out, unplugged his ergonomic mouse, wrapped the cord neatly around his palm, and tucked it into the side of the box. Sterling strode down the center aisle of the bullpen, his face flushed, his polished shoes loud against the linoleum borders of the carpet. He stopped right at the edge of Thomas's cubicle, his presence a towering shadow over the desk. "What do you think you're doing?" Sterling demanded, keeping his voice low but loaded with immense, vibrating authority. "Get real, Thomas. The theatrical display is over. You've made your point. You're stressed. I will overlook this tantrum. I will even grant you 3 days next week, provided you log in remotely during the evening hours. Now put the books back." Thomas finally paused. He stood up straight, wiping a strand of hair from his forehead. He looked around the bullpen, seeing the pale, frightened faces of his colleagues, men and women he had eaten lunch with, suffered with, and worked late into the night with for years. Then he looked at Sterling. "I'm not having a tantrum, Mr. Vance," Thomas said, his voice perfectly conversational, carrying easily through the silent room. I'm packing. You gave me an ultimatum. You dared me to quit. I'm simply fulfilling the terms of your agreement. It wasn't an agreement, you idiot. It was a reality check. Sterling hissed, leaning over the partition, dropping his voice so the rest of the floor couldn't hear the desperation creeping into the edges of his tone. Look at these people staring at you. You're making a fool of yourself. Do you have any idea what the market looks like right now? Do you know how hard it is for a senior analyst with a dependent with a pre-existing condition to find a corporate package that covers specialized pediatric surgery? I do, Thomas said. He reached out and picked up a framed 4x6 photograph that sat right next to his monitor. Sterling looked at the photo. It was a little girl with giant brown eyes and a bald head, sitting in a massive hospital bed, holding up a stuffed bear with a matching bandage over its chest. She was laughing, her small face completely illuminated with joy despite the wires trailing out from beneath her gown. I know exactly how hard it is, Thomas continued, his voice dropping into a register of profound, immovable certainty. I've spent every night for 3 years calculating the costs. I've balanced the deductibles, the co-pays, the maximum out-of-pocket limits. I stayed in this office until midnight, missing her dinners, missing her bedtime stories, missing the days when she was well enough to go to the park, all because I told myself I was doing it to keep her safe. I told myself the money was the shield. Thomas looked up from the photo, his eyes locking onto Sterling's like twin lasers. But today, you reminded me of something very important, Mr. Vance. You reminded me that shields don't matter if the person you're trying to protect is entirely alone. You told me that my presence at her bedside has no utility. You told me that the world doesn't stop spinning. Thomas placed the framed photo gently face up in the crate, right on top of his books. Well, my world does stop on Tuesday morning, Thomas said. It stops the moment they wheel her into that theater. And if it stops, I'm going to be there to hold it. You think you own me because you hold the keys to the vault. But the vault is just a room full of paper, Sterling. I can find another room. I can find another job. I can work 3 jobs if I have to. But she only has one father. And I will not let her wake up in a room full of strangers because I was too terrified of a billionaire in a grey suit. A collective, silent gasp seemed to ripple through the bullpen. Nobody had ever spoken to Sterling Vance like that. Nobody had ever used his first name without the prefix of absolute reverence. Sterling's face went white. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking older, hollower. He looked at the crate. He looked at the empty desk. The dual monitors were already dark, reflecting the cold light of the windows. You think you're a hero, Sterling whispered, his voice shaking with a potent mix of fury and genuine, unadulterated shock. You think this is a movie. You'll walk out those doors, and by next month, when the bills arrive, you'll realize the mistake you've made. I will personally ensure that every major firm in the tri-state area knows that you walked out on the Vanguard merger. You will be blacklisted, Thomas. I will wipe your name off every recruiter's ledger in this city. Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. He looked at Sterling with something that felt horribly, unacceptably like pity. I know you will, Thomas said softly, because that's the only way you know how to interact with the world. You think if you can't buy someone's loyalty, you have to destroy them to prove you're still powerful. But you don't understand, Sterling. I'm not afraid of you anymore. The moment I chose my daughter over your company, your leverage evaporated. You have nothing left to threaten me with. Thomas pulled the fabric flaps of the crate over the top, securing the Velcro straps with a sharp, definitive re-yip. He lifted the box into his arms, adjusting his weight. It wasn't heavy, but it contained the entirety of his professional life for the last 10 years. He turned to his team. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for the hard work. Good luck with the migration on Monday. For a second, nobody moved. Then, in the middle row, a young junior analyst named Marcus, a kid Thomas had spent 3 weeks training out of hours, slowly stood up. He began to clap. It was a hesitant, quiet sound at first. Sit down, Marcus, Sterling barked without looking back. Marcus didn't sit down. He kept clapping. Then, 2 desks over, a senior developer stood up and joined in. Then another. Then the project managers. Within 10 seconds, the entire 62nd floor was standing, a wall of thunderous, rhythmic applause echoing off the glass and concrete walls. It wasn't just applause for Thomas. It was a quiet, collective rebellion against the tyranny of the glass suite upstairs. Thomas smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that made him look 10 years younger. He nodded to them, turned away from the billionaire, and began the long walk toward the elevator bank. Sterling stood frozen in the center of the cubicle aisle. The applause beat against him like a physical wave, but he couldn't move. He watched Thomas's back as the man reached the silver elevators. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. Thomas stepped inside, turned around to face the floor, and held the box securely against his chest. As the doors slowly slid shut, his eyes met Sterling's one last time, not with malice, not with triumph, but with the quiet, unshakable peace of a man who had finally remembered what he was worth. The doors clicked shut. The elevator descended. The bullpen slowly grew quiet again, the applause dying down until only the hum of the computers remained. The employees slowly sat back down, but they didn't look at their screens. They looked at Sterling Vance. The billionaire stood alone in the empty cubicle. He looked at the blank monitors. He looked at the empty space where the framed photo of the little girl had been. For the first time in his life, he felt the sheer, terrifying weight of his own isolation. He had all the money in the world. He had the Vanguard merger. He had the 6th to 5th floor. But as he stood there in the silent bullpen, he realized with an icy certainty that he had absolutely nothing else.